Welcome everyone to our next webinar in the 2020 Minnesota English Language Arts Standards Implementation Support webinar series, Curriculum and Text Review. My name is Kristen Bauk and I am the English Language Arts Specialist in the Standards Instruction and Assessment Division at the Minnesota Department of Education.
Hi, I'm Chris Bretz. I'm the READAC Curriculum Specialist, part of the Literacy Unit at MDE.
Hi, I'm Emily Hanrahan. I am a literacy coach for Brightworks.
Hello, I am Molly Schned. I'm also a literacy coach with Brightworks.
This webinar is part of a series of recorded webinars designed to support teachers and school leaders in the implementation of the 2020 English Language Arts Standards, which have reached full implementation this school year, 2025-2026. You can find past webinars on the ELA implementation webpage. We are releasing these webinars one by one and hope that you will use and return to them as they align with your school's needs. Up next, we will be sharing Series 3 with a focus on media literacy, vocabulary, and grammar instruction. The Minnesota Department of Education is committed to equity. The 2020 English Language Arts Standards represent a prioritization of equity and aim to improve equitable conditions for learning for all students. We also believe that these implementation support webinars will help us ensure consistent implementation of the new standards. The goal of this implementation is to improve learning for all students and ensure that every student has an equitable education in Minnesota. Many of you are likely familiar with the Minnesota Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MNMTSS. We want to emphasize that standards implementation is not an additional task on top of or separate from MNMTSS, but it's embedded in the multi-layered practices and support as the anchor of Tier 1 instruction. We have two main topics that we are addressing in this webinar. The first is standards and curriculum alignment, where we explore the relationship between Minnesota standards and curriculum adoption and alignment. The second is text complexity and selection, where we ask what is the role of complex text in ELA and how should districts and educators select texts.
And first up is standards and curriculum alignment. We want to start our discussion about standards and curriculum by grounding ourselves in a few ways. The first is to acknowledge the central role standards play in education. In Minnesota, academic standards drive the work of K-12 teaching and learning. Other essential elements are curricular resources, school and student culture and identity, and evidence-based practices. We do want to note that curricular resources often need to be adapted and supplemented at a district level to align to the other elements of curriculum instruction. For example, curriculum may be supplemented with stronger evidence-based instructional practices or adapted to be more responsive to your students' cultures, identities, and needs. Today, we're focusing on ensuring that curricular materials align with Minnesota's academic standards in English language arts. Before getting into curriculum and standards alignment, we have to start with a deep understanding of the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards. In order to develop this understanding, here are some suggested actions. 1, downloading and reading through the new standards documents. 2, exploring the important concepts which are detailed in the front matter of the standards. 3, understanding the shifts from our 2010 standards to the 2020 standards. And 4, using the learning progression documents to understand how benchmarks increase in complexity from kindergarten through 12th grade. Resources to support all of this learning are available on the MDE ELA webpage and the MDE ELA Standards Implementation webpage. According to Dufour and Marzano, one of the most powerful things a school can do to help enhance student achievement is to guarantee that specific content is taught in specific courses and grade levels. This type of consistency is often referred to as a guaranteed and viable curriculum. A guaranteed and viable curriculum, or GVC, means that all students in a specific course or grade level are exposed to the same essential content, regardless of their teacher. It also means that teachers have the time and resources they need to effectively teach the curriculum and for students to learn it within a school year. Importantly, GVC is not just the materials. Planning and developing a GVC starts with standards, then moves to adopting materials that are in alignment with the standards. A guaranteed and viable student experience makes use of those materials and ensures that students are successful. This requires deep cultural competency and helps provide equitable learning experiences to all students. It also requires that we don't skip any of the standards. A GVC needs to bundle all benchmarks, not select only some. It's also essential to include educators in this work. The most effective instructional planning requires that district leaders and educators engage together in a collaborative process to develop a GVC. We also know that in some of Minnesota's smaller districts, one person may play multiple roles. The takeaway here is that educators and district leaders must work together in instructional planning.
Family, community, and student engagement in the curriculum process is also essential. This graphic, developed by a cross-division collaborative group at the Minnesota Department of Education, demonstrates the 7 essential elements of family engagement. Pausing here for a moment, consider where you might make connections between your curriculum adoption process and these elements. There are generally 3 approaches to curriculum development: adopting a published curriculum, developing district-specific curriculum, or a hybrid of both. Practices may differ between elementary and secondary and across disciplines as well. What we want to emphasize here is that all of these approaches require district-level work to align to the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards. It's also important to note that READ Act curricular resources were reviewed in alignment with evidence-based structured literacy practices, which was specified in the READ Act as the scope of MDE's work. Although the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards were considered as we reviewed those materials, the READ Act curriculum review process did not formally align resources to standards. Therefore, districts will need to review all potential resources, including those on the READ Act curriculum list, for alignment with state standards. Whether you adopt materials, develop materials, or go with a hybrid blend, these 6 steps will be part of your local adoption process. An adoption might focus more on investigating available materials, while district-developed materials may require more time with making a decision, which would include writing the curriculum. The standards are an essential aspect of all 6 adoption and development steps. Districts should center standards as the foundation of the adoption process. You should use the standards as part of your investigation and evaluation of potential curricula, or as a way to review your current program to establish needs. And finally, you need to align curriculum to the standards as part of the implementation process.
We have developed multiple Minnesota-specific supports for this work. The 2 that we are highlighting here are the Unpacking Benchmarks and Horizontal Vertical Alignment tool and the English Language Arts Standards and Curriculum Alignment tool. The first can be used to unpack grade-level benchmarks, evaluate potential curricula, develop curricula, and plan for supplementing and adapting curricula to meet the 2020 standards. The second can be used to investigate the similarities and differences between the 2020 ELA standards and the 2010 or Common Core standards, and consider how curricula aligned to other standards need to be supplemented and adapted to meet the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards. Most nationally published curricula are aligned to the Common Core. You can also use this tool to consider how curricula can be supplemented and adapted to meet Minnesota. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the second tool, the ELA Standards and Curriculum Alignment tool. This tool uses a color coding system to identify connections between the 2010 or Common Core standards and benchmarks and the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards and benchmarks. If you open up the tool, which is linked on the previous page in the slides, you can see that benchmarks highlighted in green are 2010 or Common Core benchmarks that are highly aligned to 2020 Minnesota benchmarks. These will not require supplementing or adapting. Yellow benchmarks are partially aligned to our new standards. These include considerations that can help with your planning as you supplement and adapt to fully align to our new standards. Finally, blue benchmarks are fully unique to 2020 Minnesota. These benchmarks do not show up in 2010 or the Common Core and will require more extensive supplementing and adapting of curriculum. As you work on full implementation of the new standards, pay attention to the yellow and blue benchmarks, as these are the areas you will want to focus your alignment work. I've been using the language of supplementing and adapting when talking about aligning curricula to standards, and I want to pause and explain what those mean along with some examples. Supplementing is adding to the curriculum to meet a benchmark. For example, increasing explicit instruction of benchmark vocabulary, skills, and concepts, including consideration of context, identity, perspective, and bias when evaluating text, which is one of the shifts in our standards and really shows up in Reading Anchor Standard 6. Strengthening media literacy instruction, we have increased media literacy standards across all 3 ELA strands, and increasing opportunities for student choice, which is a large part of our new standards. Adapting is making more extensive changes to curriculum to meet a benchmark. For example, replacing a unit to include Dakota and Anishinaabe texts and voices, including foundational reading through grade 6 and foundational writing through grade 12, or including writing to persuade in addition to writing to argue. All of these examples are drawn from the shifts in our standards from our 2010 standards to 2020. Importantly, whether a curricular shift is a supplement or an adaptation matters less than the fact that the need for alignment has been identified and planned for. We also want to note that supplementing and adapting doesn't always apply to just materials. It can apply to what is taught, how it is taught, and how it is assessed. So don't forget to look at instructional methods and assessments as you are engaging in alignment work. There are multiple approaches to standards alignment depending on your approach to curriculum, as Chris mentioned. We call 2 of these approaches the inside-out process and the outside-in process. The inside-out process starts inside your adopted curricular materials with a scope and sequence of benchmarks provided by the curriculum company. This might be more common in elementary spaces, but is also common in secondary as well for districts that choose to adopt a curriculum. Almost all of the time, any nationally published curricula will be aligned to the Common Core. So in this approach, you use the standards and alignment tool we just discussed to see how your adopted curriculum needs to be supplemented and adapted in order to meet the 2020 ELA standards and benchmarks. The outside-in process is more common for district-developed or hybrid approaches, where teams use a unit design method, such as understanding by design, to identify which grade level benchmarks bundle well together into an instructional unit. Then curricular materials are chosen after the full year scope and sequence of benchmarks is developed. It's important to note that both of these approaches must start with a strong understanding of the standards, even if you have a goal of staying relatively close to your adopted curriculum. That strong understanding is what will help you know what needs to shift in order to meet our Minnesota standards. ELA standards and the work of the READ Act are complementary. We like to think of the standards as the what and the evidence-based practices aligned to structured literacy, the focus of the READ Act, as the how. We are currently working to connect the what and the how even more through additional supports, which will be shared as they are developed. We also want to remind you that ultimately alignment work and curricular decisions are locally determined. This year, the Regional Literacy Network, which is housed across Minnesota in the Minnesota Service Cooperatives and is a part of COMPASS, the statewide system of continuous improvement, is providing regional support for curriculum adoption and standards alignment. You can contact your regional literacy lead for more information about regional support opportunities. Each district's district literacy lead, or DLL, is a key communication and point person in this work as well.
Now we're going to move on to text complexity and selection, which is a hot button topic for many ELA teachers. First and foremost, this section of the webinar really draws heavily on the ELA standards glossary and appendices, which is available on the main MDE English Language Arts webpage. Appendix B focuses on text complexity and text selection, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so text complexity can be defined as the level of difficulty in reading and understanding a text based on a series of factors, including the readability of a text, levels of meaning or purpose of the text, structure of the text, and the conventionality and clarity of the language and knowledge demands of the text. Text complexity can be characterized by a range of qualitative and quantitative features and depends on the reader and the task for which the text is selected. If you are reviewing curriculum to pilot or adopt, evaluating the text complexity of those curricular materials as you're moving through that adoption process is very important. If you're developing curricula, ensure that you can take complexity into account when determining grade level anchor texts for instructional units. Include a note about, kind of as you're thinking about this, kind of think through this kind of inside out and kind of how you're supplementing standards or not, and keep that in mind if to ensure that you're developing strong text complexity alongside either in-house made units or curricula that is purchased. Okay, so research tells us that students should spend lots of time actively reading or listening, in the early grades especially, to complex texts that advance both the breadth and the depth of their vocabulary, and their ability to access kind of layers of meaning and understanding structure and knowledge of the world. Despite this research, many students are denied a rich learning experience with grade level text due to a widespread use of leveling and tracking systems and an over-reliance on a single indicator of text complexity, such as Lexile, to match a student to a reading material. Beyond just exposure to grade level text, all students need regular opportunities to practice and apply the skills identified in English language arts standards and benchmarks with grade level text. So for example, it's not possible for a student to learn and apply an 8th grade level benchmark with a 4th grade level text. That text is not complex enough to support the comprehension and analysis skills and knowledge identified in those benchmarks. So scaffolds and differentiation, including listening to complex text to support the development of language comprehension, can assist in providing access to grade level text for students who need that additional support. This does not mean that every text a student reads must be at grade level complexity. In addition to grade level anchor text, students need a large volume of reading with text with a range of complexities. One way to maximize knowledge and vocabulary growth is by engaging students with text sets, which is kind of groups of resources that all have a same connected topic to support frequent and varied reading. Students can build background knowledge with different text complexities and different types of text, such as graphic novels, videos, websites, magazines, and having those before and alongside engaging in kind of grade level benchmarks with grade level anchor texts. In addition to grade level anchor text, students need a volume of reading with text at a range of complexity levels. Text sets can help achieve this. A text set is a group of texts connected to a topic or theme with grade level anchor text, in addition to other types of multimodal texts with a range of complexities. The Reading Anchor Standard 1 in the 2020 ELA standards calls for students to know and apply grade level phonics and word analysis skills in decoding words. Decodable text is simple text that is written for a beginning reader and contains specific grapheme-phoneme correspondences that the students have learned, and it's a necessary part of a phonics lesson for cementing that learning. This text provides learners with the opportunity to use their developing segmenting and blending skills to read words in order to develop an automaticity or the ability to kind of recognize words quickly and effortlessly and experience an kind of independent reading progress. Decodable text encourages children to sound out words using these decoding strategies rather than guessing from pictures or predicting from other cues. They can be introduced once beginning readers have learned some simple grapheme phoneme correspondences and can blend from left to right. All books are technically decodable in the sense that they can be read, but only if the reader has sufficient reading ability for the complexity of the text. So for beginning readers, the only books that are truly decodable are those that contain the alphabetic code that they have specifically learned. Importantly, along with decodable text, students must have access to complex grade level text through read alouds and audiobooks so that they can continue to develop their listening comprehension, even as they strengthen their word recognition skills. So how do we choose? There is sadly no exact science for determining text complexity. There are a lot of factors that go into it. And there's not a single source of information that can accurately summarize your text complexity. Educators must use a variety of tools and thoughtfully consider the selection of texts across the day, unit, or year to advance student knowledge and understanding. Text selection, deciding which texts have to be taught in a curriculum, should include a consideration of the quantitative and qualitative complexity of a text. Should also consider the cultural relevance and responsiveness and the meaningfulness and relevance of the tasks that the text supports. The planning and teaching of standards, including knowledge and skills, should be the foundation of any curriculum, unit, or lesson plan. Selected text should support the building of knowledge and skills identified in grade level benchmarks. The appendix on text complexity and selection includes multiple tools and resources for each of these three considerations. So be sure to check out that resource for more information. So the 2020 ELA standards explicitly call for the inclusion of Dakota and Anishinaabe text in both student-selected and teacher-selected reading. These are some additional resources for selecting, evaluating, and teaching these texts, and I highly recommend checking some of these out. Finally, please be sure to review our previous webinar involving student choice in selection text, which is available on the MDE Standards Implementation webpage for additional resources and supports around text selection in the classroom.
Thank you so much for reviewing this webinar. Please reach out with any questions and keep an eye out for additional webinars and additional supports coming from MDE and the Regional Literacy Network.